Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating piece of ancient history that speaks volumes about the psychology and strategy of our modern world. We're going to explore how the story of Deborah gives us this brilliant structured blueprint for finding spiritual courage when fear absolutely controls a nation. Because honestly, this isn't just some dusty story about an ancient battle. It is a profound case study on leadership, faith, and what it actually takes to stand firm when everything around you just seems to be falling apart.
So think about this for a second. What actually happens when fear controls a nation? What happens when people lose hope, when leaders just go quiet, and the darkness seems way stronger than faith? Right now, we're all facing incredibly intense modern pressures, right? We're navigating economic uncertainty, deep social division, endless anxiety about the future, global conflicts, and it prompts so many of us to look around and ask, where is God during all of these overwhelming times?
Well, to answer that, we really need to look at the cycle of fear and see how ancient crises perfectly parallel our modern ones. To really grasp this dynamic, we've got to look at the ancient texts of Judges chapters 4 and 5. The nation of Israel found themselves totally trapped in this highly destructive, repeating loop. It went like this. A society would follow God for a comfortable season, then it only takes about one single generation for complacency to set in, and they drift into sin. Now, that drift, it led to 20 years of severe oppression. In this specific case, under a Canaanite king named Jabin. And then, only in a single day of utter desperation would they finally cry out for help. It's a brilliant, if kind of tragic illustration of human nature. We just tend to completely forget our foundations when things are comfortable, and we only seek divine help when we are backed into a corner by a massive crisis. And that oppression, it came in the form of a staggering number: 900. For 20 long years, the people of Israel were absolutely paralyzed by King Jabin's military commander, a guy named Sisera. Why? Because Sisera possessed a terrifying state-of-the-art arsenal of 900 iron chariots. You've got to understand, in the ancient world, an iron chariot wasn't just a vehicle. It was literally a tank. Imagine 900 tanks parked just outside your city limits for 2 whole decades. The highways were abandoned, people hid in their villages. Absolute fear just became the normal, everyday reality for an entire generation.
So Israel is facing this completely overwhelming threat: 900 ancient tanks and 20 years of deep trauma. But what is God's counter strategy here? He doesn't send a bigger army. Instead, he raises up Deborah, and her arsenal, it consists of prophetic vision, an ability to hear God's voice, and a highly hesitant military general named Barak. Humanly speaking, matching up ancient tanks against spiritual vision makes absolutely zero sense, but it really reveals that God's methods for deliverance almost never match up with what we humanly expect.
Which brings us to how an unexpected leader rises, simply by leading from God's voice. In Israel's absolute darkest, most fear-drenched moment, Deborah emerges, not as a warrior swinging a sword, but as a prophetess and a judge. While the rest of the nation was panicking, Deborah was listening. Because true spiritual leadership isn't controlled by panic or public opinion. It is anchored in truth. She turns to her military commander, Barak, who, by the way, is a guy with an incredible resume, but is completely, utterly paralyzed by fear. And she asks him this piercing question: "Has not the Lord commanded you?" You see, Barak was obsessing over the iron chariots, but Deborah, she was looking right at God's promise. Fear whispers that the enemy is too strong, but Deborah puts right through all that noise to remind him that God's calling is infinitely greater than human hesitation. It all comes down to chariots versus spiritual faith and where we actually place our trust. This whole situation sets up a massive collision of worldviews. Barak agreed to go to battle, but basically only if Deborah chaperoned him. He recognized that her spiritual authority and her connection to God mattered way more than any military strategy he could ever devise. Sisera, on the flip side, trusted his literal iron chariots. And today, well, we have our own modern iron chariots, don't we? Our economic systems, military power, advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and human political influence. When a crisis hits, these are exactly the things people instinctively run to. But as this ancient text reminds us, economies shift, governments change, and tech fails. None of these systems can ever replace the ultimate security that's found in God. That unwavering trust leads to this incredible moment at Mount Tabor. Barak and 10,000 vastly outgunned men are standing there, literally looking down at hundreds of iron chariots. The tension must have been completely suffocating. But Deborah steps up and delivers this pivotal, history-changing declaration. She says, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands." Notice she doesn't wait for the chariots to retreat. She doesn't wait for some strategic advantage. She boldly declares the victory before a single sword is even swung. And right here, this exposes a massive gap between two totally different mindsets. Modern culture tells us, hey, believe only after you see the proof. We want the data, we want the guarantee, the visual confirmation before we ever commit to a single thing. But biblical faith, it operates in the exact opposite direction. It demands that we trust God before the outcome is even visible. Deborah declared victory while the enemy was still fully assembled and looking completely invincible. That is what true courage actually looks like.
This perfectly illustrates how victory often comes through unlikely hands, totally dismantling human pride.
When that kind of radical faith is activated, God steps in and just completely dismantles human pride. The historical sources describe a massive storm suddenly flooding the battlefield. The very thing the enemy trusted most, their heavy iron chariots, instantly became their greatest weakness as they got entirely trapped in the mud. Suddenly, bringing tanks to a mud fight wasn't such a genius idea. The commander, Sisera, is forced to abandon his ultimate weapon and run away on foot. He seeks refuge in the tent of an ordinary woman named Jael, and it is Jael, not the big General Barak, who ultimately defeats the dreaded enemy commander. It's such a profound reminder. God is searching for availability, not perfection. You might feel too weak or too ordinary, but God absolutely delights in using completely unlikely people to bring about massive deliverance.
Following this miraculous victory, Deborah does something really fascinating. She doesn't just throw a party to celebrate, she sings a song of worship, actively using worship as an act of resistance. By singing and recording this song, she intentionally built a spiritual memory for her nation. Because let's face it, people panic in a crisis because they forget what God has done in the past. Deborah teaches us that when society becomes super unstable, you have to worship anyway, pray anyway, trust anyway, speak truth anyway. Public praise in the very middle of instability is a profound, defiant act of resistance against fear.
So, let's look at 5 specific truths we can take from this to navigate our modern crises today. How do we actually take all this historical and spiritual data and apply it to our lives right now? Well, it really breaks down into 5 timeless truths. First up, God still raises courageous leaders. Even in eras of deep political confusion and moral compromise, God is actively calling people to stand for truth. Second, fear does not have the final word. Intimidation can absolutely be broken by faith. Third, God uses ordinary people. You do not need celebrity status or some massive platform for your life to matter. Fourth, spiritual clarity matters immensely in a crisis. The world doesn't just need more noise, it desperately needs believers who can actually hear God clearly, just like Deborah did. And finally, number 5, victory belongs to the Lord. Human strength alone, no matter how advanced our modern iron chariots become, simply cannot save nations. We know the world can feel dark. We know the iron chariots of our day, financial stress, anxiety, division, they seem incredibly loud and imposing right now. But the real question isn't whether the world is getting darker. The provocative question we all must answer is this: will believers rise with courage? Will you allow fear to silence your calling? Or will you, just like Deborah, dare to trust God before you ever see the outcome and become the exact voice of courage your generation desperately needs? Think about that as you navigate your own challenges this week.